Hello and welcome. We are seeing the first signs of the coming Ukrainian offensive. This and more in this situation report. The US have published the video from the Reaper incident where an MQ-9 Reaper was brought down by a Russian fighter jet. The Russians say they didn't touch the plane, didn't touch the drone, it came down by itself. We now have a video. You see the Sukhoi 27 coming close here. The observation is done from the initial ball mount, and you see it dumping fuel here, trying to probably even set the drone ablaze with an initial burst of its afterburners at the same time. Now we see the second approach. Again, the same thing. And here the video cuts for a moment before it returns. Probably the shaking from the impact. But we see it finishing here, and there you could see it really well. That this one is bent over, and the other two times we see the drone's propeller blades are different as well. If you see it here, it's bent. This seems to be straight, and this seems to be the one seems to be normal, whereas the second one seems to be completely bent, like parallel to the flying course. It's clearly showing that the drone was hit. Interesting too, though, is that it apparently, we don't see anything under the wing here, which we should probably moving over here. So that seems to show that it didn't carry Gorgon Stare, which was one guess from my side that this could at least explain why this particular drone was taken down in the specific video I made over the incidents. That Gorgon Stare has extremely high resolution cameras, but cannot transfer the data by a satellite, so it has to let. So that could have been a theoretical option, that it was taken down to prevent some things getting public, but we see here there was no Gorgon Stare on board. When we come to the Eastern Front on the battlefield, though, we have no real change in possession. There are some reports of fighting. There's some Russian claims that they managed to cross over the Oskil here at Dvorichna. I have no visual proof of that whatsoever. Other than that, we have different reports of fighting, but no confirmed change in possession of territory here. More or less, it increasingly seems that the Russian offensive has run out of steam. Further south, we have a geolocated, let me see. We have a geolocated position of a fighting in a trench at this position here, which is directly up here. Let me see here. So it should be more or less here if we zoom in on the field of the battle, which shows that the Russians are creeping closer to that line of communication going to Hromove. They haven't reached it yet, and the fighting there, the video seems to indicate that the Russians were repulsed, even though it was already fighting for the trench itself that the Ukrainians have built up there. There is a video on Telegram which says that it's translated from a Russian Telegram channel, pro-Russian Telegram channel, that according to that, the whole line is already in the line of communication there can be fired upon with ATGM, and it's shown as a proof here that this Ukrainian, I think it should be a BTR-4, is destroyed and burning out on this very position. In the north of the city of Bakhmut, the Russians are also advancing somewhat in that area here. Fighting is continuing. They have not achieved a breakthrough, but they keep advancing in this regard. We have Telegram here. War Gonzo, one of the big Russian military bloggers, he's claiming that the Russians have cut off the main supply line in the south, which would be here. So he's saying they basically crossed over here over the T0504. I have not seen any visual proof of this, so it can be true. It does not have to be true, but in that regard, it would not cut off the main supply line, as the Ukrainians can easily use those side roads here to keep supplying the town. But as you can see, they're coming closer on the line of communication here, and they're coming closer on the line of communications in the south as well. The pressure is continuing to mount up. Other than that, we don't have much from that region. We have reports of fighting around Avdiivka, Russian attacks towards Siverne and towards Pervomaiske. Again, no confirmed gains of territory. And I have an interesting video, which should be from Marinka, where we can see fighting in... this is... yeah. Where we can see, that should be Marinka. And what you can see here is likely a 30mm autocannon, probably from a BMP-2 or a BTR-82 that is firing on a building, where you can see how powerful autocannons are in house-to-house fighting, in urban combat. As we can see, it sets fire and then even gets parts of buildings to come crashing down. We've seen that in the past too in Syria, where the Syrians have used their Shilkas, the generally obsolete air defense, self-propelled air defense system, which has 4 23mm autocannons for great effect, as those autocannons are powerful enough to basically go through any cover with a short salvo. So if you are in a position here and fight and shoot towards the enemy, being even behind a concrete pillar does not offer you any protection if you're being fired upon with an autocannon. And I think this video was an impressive reminder of that fact, so I chose to show it to you. We also have reports from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and they are claiming they found this diary. According to the calculation there, out of 434 soldiers, only 57 have survived, which would be roughly 13%. Obviously, this is about fighting at Vuhledar. I have no way whatsoever to confirm this. This can be written. Not only can't I read what I can see there, what is visible here, but this so-called diary might as very well have been written by a Ukrainian soldier and being handed over and to use for propaganda purposes, as the Ukrainian losses on the front line are heavy as well. It makes a lot of sense to fake some supposed evidence showing that the Russian losses are much, much higher if you want to keep morale high. That doesn't mean it is faked. It just says that there is no way whatsoever for us to prove, to come to a conclusion whether this is an actual diary from a Russian officer or not. Along the southern front line, we have reports that the Ukrainians tried to come over the Kakhovka dam close to Nikopol here. Supposedly they were repulsed, but they were supposedly trying to do a recon attack here. And now it's becoming interesting when we come to recon attacks, because we have a massive amount of recon attacks in comparison to the past, at least, being reported along the Zaporizhzhia front line. We have mostly attacks coming close to Orikhiv, south of this here. We have attacks going in the direction of Polony, which should be coming here, south of Huliapole. And we have reports of recon attacks coming in the western part of Donetsk, so more or less they should be in this region. Those reports are coming from the Russians, and they are saying, from everything we see, they are sometimes mechanized, sometimes just infantry. Often, I've even read about company-sized attacks, so we're talking about maybe 100 men going forward. This does not look like any serious attempt to break through the Russian line, but it seems like we are actually having reconnaissance in force here that is being done by the Ukrainians, which is a sign of offensive activity on a front line where I cannot recall any recent Ukrainian offensive activity for months. This comes in we also have this for instance, Russian military blogger here who says that they managed to get through the minefields that because they were using Western mine rollers, anti-mine systems. In this regard, all of this is the Russian side is saying that this is the Ukrainians are trying to find out how to break through here. And in my mind when we see the reports, and I have it now of over 3 days of reports of fighting there, of Ukrainian attacks. In my mind, that looks like the Ukrainians are preparing the counteroffensive and that it's actually getting closer. Because these recon attacks obviously have to be done in close proximity of the actual attack. If they do recon in force now, find out that what they need to know, and then wait 4 weeks for an attack, then all the reconnaissance they gained, a big part of it will already be obsolete, will no longer be up to date, so kind of getting useless. In this regard, we should expect a Ukrainian counteroffensive to begin within 1, maybe 2 weeks. Now, I don't want to expose myself with some false claims here. This is my guesswork. I don't say the Ukrainians will attack here. But we've seen the same with Balaklia, for instance, that we suddenly heard an uptick of Ukrainian artillery fire. And I, at that time, just reported it without connecting the dots. And as we expect a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south, and 2 days ago I even read that some Russian military bloggers were claiming the Ukrainians have concentrated 40,000 soldiers in southern Zaporizhia already, this would indicate that a Ukrainian counteroffensive might start soon. I want to emphasize might here. I'm not saying it's going to start in the next 2 weeks, but it's increasingly looking like it is about to start fairly soon. Generally, though, that would be in perfect unison and it would fit perfectly with the reports we have from other parts of the front line, because the Ukrainians are reporting a significant drop down of the Russian offensive activity. Either the Russians are increasingly holding back their offensives, or they are actually expanded. They have expanded their offensive potential. They've reached their culmination point at this point. This is both reported from Luhansk, where the attacks are not just going down and are opening up possibilities for Ukrainian local counteroffensives, and we at least have had counterattacks by the Ukrainians. But the same is even reported from Bakhmut, where the offensive activity from the Russian is significantly going down despite some advances. And when we can see the advances somewhere in the north here, that for instance it was proudly pronounced that Salisnyanske was conquered by Wagner, which is confirmed by now. We're talking about a tiny village here. That seems to be increasingly that the Russians are attacking wherever they feel like they can gain a small victory to officially proclaim that they captured another town, because their potential to actually focus on where the main focus of the war should happen around Bakhmut is no longer. They are at these positions where they can actually achieve a victory. For instance, by pushing through here, they are increasingly no longer capable of doing that. Now, all of this might be a little premature, but at least from an observer's point of view, it indicates to me that the Ukrainian counteroffensive can be expected in a fair amount of time, and that the Russians are at least nearing their culmination point, so the point where their offensive will falter and the strategic initiative can return back to the Ukrainian side. From partisans, we have reports that on the 14th of March, partisans have killed the collaborator Ivan Tkach, I guess, in Melitopol with an IED. Melitopol remains one of the main points of partisan resistance from the Ukrainian side, but the Russians are also doing something. They are saying here that they just captured 3 partisans together with weapon caches in Zaporizhia Oblast, which is that very point. When it comes to the mobilization, Russia is still trying to improve its manpower and its fighting power. The Duma has now increased by law the power of Russian officers to punish their soldiers even without a court order. That should be seen as a sign of bad morale and as a reaction to the big amount of videos that are complaining about the situation. Obviously, with Russian officers having the right to immediately punish soldiers, that should curb down on videos like this if they are immediately followed by consequences. Prigozhin has now declared that he is going to recruit 30,000 fighters until the mid of May. Right now, he claims that 500 to 800 men are being recruited daily, sometimes even 1,200. There is no proof whatsoever for that, and it seems highly unlikely. He might have opened 42 recruitment centers all over Russia. He might focus on hooligans, on sports clubs, martial arts clubs, and things like this to recruit fighters. But whether that's going to be successful to that degree should be at least seriously doubted. The Duma has also introduced a law that is now punishing to the crime of discrediting fighters for the special military operations. So if you fought in the war against Ukraine, you are a veteran, and that way to discredit you can be punished with up to 7 years in prison as of now. But at the same time, we have very interesting things from Prigozhin here. Prigozhin published on his press service, he claimed that on his Telegram channel, or at least not himself, but his press service claimed that there was a press request that asked him to comment on a discussion between Putin and the head of the National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, that they were talking about basically eliminating Wagner. I'm scrolling it down so you can read it for yourself and pause if needed. Patrushev said, according to that Wagner will be taken out within 1 month to 1.5 months, and after that, Prigozhin, according to Patrushev, will collect the remaining Wagner soldiers. He will arm them and then try to take over bordering regions of Russia, take over military control of that, and then use that to advance into the inland. Basically, the claim is that Prigozhin wants to do not a military coup, but rather start a civil war, become a warlord, and conquer Russian territory. Patrushev, according to that, said he's already ordered the surveillance of former Wagner fighters in response to that. And according to that, Putin responded to agreed with that and thanked Wagner and thanked Patrushev for his work to neutralize the PMCs and Prigozhin himself. Obviously, heavy news. We would discuss when this means that Prigozhin is going to fall out of a window anytime soon. The interesting thing is, though, that the newspaper who supposedly wrote this press request has by now denied that it was involved in this, that it didn't come from him, from them. So supposedly either Prigozhin was inventing it to have a scapegoat for Wagner's likely failing at Bakhmut, where Wagner is still having the main effort of the Russian offensive and is still spearheading the attacks. It seems increasingly unlikely that the Russians will be able to actually conquer Bakhmut, at least it's highly doubtful at this point. Should he fail at Bakhmut, then all his expenditure of personnel around Bakhmut was completely in vain. He cannot present the big prize he fought for 9 months by now, and then he'll need a scapegoat if he doesn't want to be punished by himself. And there might be the option that Prigozhin is going to prepare who might be responsible for that, but it seems kind of unlikely at the same point. It seems more likely that somebody basically staged this press request to cause dissent within the Russian Siloviki and within the Russian leadership and within the Russian fighting forces, as it seems fairly unlikely that in an attempt to create a scapegoat, he would involve Putin in that himself, basically exposing himself to the wrath of the Russian president himself. As if we take the theory that this press request might be staged, then we have an obvious person to blame for that. That might be the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian intelligence agency, because should they achieve that, to call dissent in this regard, that might lead to unexpected outcomes, either Prigozhin being taken out by the Russian government, by the FSB, for instance, or it might lead that Prigozhin might abandon his positions around the front line to allow for his forces to consolidate, to stay together, to keep the forces close and withdraw them as he expects any attempt on his life or anything like this. So in my book, obviously there's no way to prove it, but it seems clear now that a newspaper has not asked for a comment, and it seems if we see that Putin himself was involved, it seems fairly unlikely that involved in the story, it seems fairly unlikely that Prigozhin invented it. It seems more likely that it might have been the Ukrainian military intelligence, the Ukrainian intelligence, or maybe some other Siloviki, someone else who wants to take out Prigozhin to better his own position in this regard. Prigozhin also said that now there are Afghans in Ukraine for Wagner. A few months ago, there was this report that that Wagner is trying to recruit former Afghan commandos. They should not be confused with the regular Afghan National Army or the Afghan National Police, which were more or less a useless fighting force. The commandos, on the other hand, were actually well respected within the Western community, whom they fought alongside. So those commandos could be an improvement to the Russian fighting force if they are able to recruit them in bigger numbers. And here Prigozhin has now said that there are some, but there are some weird things, like he claims they are being used to fight US provided artillery. Okay. And that they're being trained on on captured Javelin missiles. So it might be true that some Afghans have arrived, but we are probably talking about a few handful, definitely not the thousands and tens of thousands that were at some point contemplated to be potentially recruited at a later point. Other than that, when it comes to the fourth generation efforts by Russia, we have reports from all over Russia that the recruitment offices are contacting men again to ask them to update their informations with the recruitment offices. So they are not being called up yet, but this is exactly the same that happened before the last mobilization wave. So in this regard, it seems likely or far from impossible that a second mobilization wave is actually going to come at some point in the next few months. Obviously, we should probably talk about what happened in the political sphere as well. And there, the International Criminal Court has called for the arrest of Vladimir Putin for war crimes. Politically, this is really important because he's basically being called a war criminal internationally by a mostly internationally recognized institution. But I think in actuality, this is more or less irrelevant because he will be granted diplomatic immunity in every country he's traveling to until, at the very least, he's leaving office. And most Russia experts think that Putin will only leave the Kremlin if he's being carried out, either because of natural causes or because of some attempt on his life that has been successful. And if we see that who is actually accepting the authority, we have this map here, and we see that red have never signed, and yellow have have not yet ratified it, so they are not really obliged to follow that. Green are the ones that acknowledge the ICC, but Russia is not accepting the authority of the ICC, and it has to be said with some, even though some of my viewers might not like it, there's some irony into Biden mentioning the ICC and the importance of that decision when we see the US also having that color on the same map, because the United States themselves also don't recognize the relevance and the authority of the ICC. So generally, Putin should be fine traveling into every country that is red and yellow to begin with. And there have been examples in the past, for instance, while South Africa has acknowledged the ICC and has ratified the contracts, the former Sudanese dictator Bashir has traveled to South Africa without being arrested while he was in office. It seems extremely unlikely that Putin will ever go into a country where he can be arrested. That will be solved beforehand. So this is more or less a political gesture. I don't see this having any actual effect. It'll be more unpleasant, though, for Maria Alexeyevna Lvova-Belova, who is the woman who was on the TV with Putin saying she herself has adopted some Ukrainian children, who is the responsible person for the deportations of Ukrainian children here, because she is not a government official that will get some diplomatic immunity. Should she ever be insane enough to travel to a Western country, it seems highly likely that she will actually get arrested in this regard. But for Putin itself, it doesn't seem like there is any serious threat of criminal prosecution. Erdogan has now announced that the Finland's application for NATO membership will be ratified in Turkey. So there's seems to be nothing standing in the way of Finland joining NATO now, but Sweden is still not going to be ratified because he still says that all the issues with Sweden are not yet solved. On Monday, in 2 days, Xi Jinping, the Chinese dictator, will arrive in Moscow for a 3-day state visit. It seems that Xi Jinping is going to do this as a sign of support for Putin, for Russia. Russia is likely going to hope that negotiations will lead to some military aid, especially when it comes to weapon deliveries and to armaments. And Xi Jinping will likely try to paint China and himself as some kind of peacemaker by trying to advertise for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Obviously, a ceasefire would be purely in Russia's interest, as it would cement the situation on the ground with a lot of Ukrainian territory being occupied, especially if it's done right before a Ukrainian counteroffensive. And if a ceasefire is actually being established and it's holding up afterwards, it seems highly likely that the relative balance in the military power will very much shift to the Russian side, as the support from the West will likely dry down, whereas Russia will have time to rearm and to train more forces. So while a ceasefire might be in Chinese interest to generate, to paint Xi Jinping as an international peacemaker and China as a neutral arbitrary, a neutral negotiator, for Russia, it'll be a big benefit, any ceasefire, and for Ukraine, it will be a disaster. We have reports of a plan to take over Moldova as well. This was supposedly published in the leaked in connection with the same plan, with a plan to take over Belarus as well, that we've talked about in the past in situation reports. And the Moldovan president, she said that the measures that are being outlined are more or less in line what Moldova has faced over the last time when it comes to Russian interference into its national authority and its national integrity. The Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, is now no longer saying he's not going to announce sanctions against Russia. This is obviously a big step, as he is more or less an ally of Putin in the center of Europe, or at least in the Balkans. But the Serbian economy minister has said before that he asked for sanctions to be introduced because Serbia is paying such a high price for refusing sanctions as of now. Vučić didn't say he's going to introduce, or he's not going to. He said that the potential introduction of sanctions will be due to outside pressure, not because he necessarily wants to, but he no longer said we will never do it. He says if we are forced to, then we will, but basically he'll only do it once he is forced to. When it comes to international support, we have a video here from the Canadian Army of more Leopard 2A4 being sent towards Ukraine. They are ready here, being made ready to be flown to Europe. We also have reports from Romania that it supplied a mobile hospital complex, you see here, with armored trucks, etc. And we have reports about help when it comes to fighter planes. I made a video yesterday, you might have missed that. Slovakia is delivering 13 MiG-29. The reports are, though, that 2 of those MiG-29s are without engines, so only 11 are possibly operational. Depends on how many jet engines to spare Ukraine might have. Otherwise, the other 2 are probably going to be used to cannibalize them for spare parts. The 4 Polish MiG-29s are already announced, and they'll arrive in Ukraine within 6 weeks. In total, they are supposed to add up to a dozen Polish plus 13 Slovakian, so in total probably 25 MiG-29s that are going to arrive. No answer, though, how many of those are operational right away. And when it comes to the international or to the Twitter rumors and so on that you might find, I have not found in several hours of research any proof that those jets can use Western air-to-air missiles, which also wouldn't make much sense, as they were inherited with a big stock of fitting air-to-air missiles, and they were inherited with the obvious expectation that those planes will be replaced at some point, as the dependence from Russia for spare parts was no longer intended, and as the numbers were never big, investing in modifying those planes for Western air-to-air missiles while the time is running out for those planes, and while the stock, there was a big stock of air-to-air missiles, made no sense. I have not found a single picture regarding any rumors. To me, I don't see it. I don't see any proof that those jets, those MiG-29, could use Sidewinder or MRAM, which would obviously be really important, especially with the MRAM, as it would give the Ukrainians the ability to use active radar homing missiles, which they right now don't have. Every air-to-air missile those planes were coming with will likely be nothing new, will likely bring nothing new to the table for the Ukrainians. From what I found, they basically just come with the missiles the Ukrainians already have. Still though, there's still additional aid. Slovakia will deliver KUP, air-to-air, ground-to-air, surface-to-air missile systems. They are getting obsolete now, more or less obsolete. They are a predecessor of the Buk, which became famous for shooting down the civilian plane in eastern Ukraine. But they, depending on the version, they can't even reach 10,000 meters in altitude. So they are limited in their capability. But as long as they work, they will definitely be of use to intercept cruise missiles or low-flying planes. But especially against cruise missiles, they will be of big use. Slovakia is supposedly delivering several systems and a 3-digit number of missiles to use. So quite some help for the Ukrainian air defense in this regard. And we have a report from Politico. According to this, China has already delivered aid to Russia, but the interesting part is we're talking about 1,000 assault rifles, and I can't say whether those were actually assault rifles or hunting rifles as they were supposedly declared. They also have several tons of body armor have been delivered, and drone pieces, at least if Politico is right. But the important thing is, if we look at the companies involved, at least those were private companies, not government-run companies. Now, it seems highly unlikely that those companies are allowed to sell those items without government approval in China to Russia. But at least it shows that the Chinese government still tries to keep up, at least to this point, some plausible deniability when it comes to military aid for Russia. And finally, we have Ukraine saying that Russia right now is negotiating with Myanmar and other countries in both Africa and the Middle East for buying ammunition for its weaponry. Obviously, in those areas, there is a lot of Soviet-style weaponry in use. And a lot of them are cash-strapped, so there might be some interest to sell additional ammunition. But that's what Ukraine is saying. We don't have any proof or any confirmation of sales that have actually happened. And finally, we have two interesting videos. I'll shorten it a little bit. What we have here is a Ukrainian T-64BM, which is actually getting hit by an ATGM, by an anti-tank guided missile. At least according to the description, it could have been some heat shell from another tank as well, or it could have been a handheld anti-tank missile, but we see it from the perspective what happens inside of the tank. And don't worry, you don't see anybody dying or being wounded. Okay, that was now a little unfortunate because we apparently missed the hit. Sorry. Now you should have heard it. Now you should have heard it. The hit, and we see finally, we see here the tank. And what you can clearly see is how the ERA is missing. So there we see what explosive reactive armor actually helps. And a T-64BM is a Ukrainian modified T-64, modernized as well, and it is carrying noshed ERA, which is much better than what the T-64BV are usually having, that are being used here. That are being used by the majority of the Ukrainian units. See, it burnt off a lot of it, but the tank more or less stayed intact. There's some damage on top, but most of that should be repairable. We have a report here. They say commander side machine gun and wind sensor have been damaged, but nothing that should not be possible to fix, and the crew survived. And we have something here which is just a funny picture. So supposedly some of the Russian soldiers want to have some fun and have seen pictures from the volunteer group in China. I think they are the ones that popularized the shark teeth. What we do have here is a BMP-2M, a modernized version with thermal optics, more modern anti-tank missiles and other stuff, and it has some shark tooth painted on it. I thought that it's looking kind of interesting. That was why I showed it to you. Now, this was it for today. If you enjoyed the situation report, please hit the like button. It really helps with the algorithm, as well as leaving comments. They really help pushing up the channel, so I really appreciate you commenting on it. Do you think the Ukrainian offensive is coming, or do you think I'm going too far here? Leave your comments in the comment section, and if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting the channel. Your help is really helping out a lot. That was it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.